I'm Theresa Gillespie. I'm a longtime oncology nurse. I also am a nurse scientist and I'm a professor at Emory University. And I'm also associate director for the Winship Cancer Institute with a focus on what the NCI calls community outreach and engagement, which is really focused on our catchment area, which is the entire state of Georgia, and decreasing the burden of cancer throughout all of that population. So my history in oncology, I was a staff nurse and a charge nurse on an inpatient unit in oncology. And then I was introduced to clinical trials as a staff nurse and became involved with one of the first community clinical oncology programs, which was in rural South Carolina. And I just fell in love with clinical trials and the whole idea of being able to reach people who had a diagnosis of cancer and could benefit from being on clinical trials wherever they would be, whether it was in a rural setting, in an urban setting, no matter what their background was, if they had came from a lower socioeconomic background or from some other race or ethnicity that was less well represented on clinical trials. So I developed a real passion for that early on in my oncology career. And then when I went on and got my doctoral degree, my PhD dissertation was actually on looking at different approaches to inform decision making and how could we make that more equitable so that people would actually be better informed, and therefore my thought was they would then be more willing to participate in a clinical trial. So from that point, I was directing clinical trials at Emory in the Cancer Center. And it was really something very important to all of us who worked in clinical trials to have good representation. So that would include older and younger patients, women and men, people from racial and ethnic groups. So really have good representation. And we worked very hard to try to make sure patients were well informed, that if there were structural barriers to clinical trials, such as transportation or lodging, that we could find resources to help them to address those barriers. We also worked very hard with providers so that providers did not operate under an implicit bias where they just would kind of look at a patient and say, I'm just not sure this person is a good candidate. Or they would look at the chart and say, oh, this person is 75 and I'm not even going to raise the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial without even looking at this person who, for all they knew, was a marathon runner. So those are, I think, the mainstays in terms of what are barriers from providers themselves, what are barriers from patients or their family members, and what are structural barriers that are present in every healthcare system in terms of distance that people may have to drive, parking issues, lodging and transportation, childcare, you know, are there out-of-pocket costs that are going to be problematic? So all of these things represent structural barriers to enrollment. But the real importance of having this representation of people that are eligible and making sure that anyone who's eligible has that opportunity to consider the opportunity to be on a clinical trial, be informed about what those options are, and then to make an informed decision about whether they want to participate or not, is so important because of the main principle of generalizability. So if a clinical trial is just limited in terms of participation to, let's say, just all white men, which was the case for a long time, and not just in cancer, but in cardiac care, et cetera, then you're having to extrapolate those data and those results to everybody else. And we know very well that for a long time, women were not well represented on trials, and their pathophysiology is very different from men. And so results of those clinical trials that only contain men were being applied to women with very poor results. And it's the same way. While race and ethnicity are social constructs, they're not biological. We do know that there may be some difference based on genetic ancestry. but also people from rural areas. They have different exposures. They have different perspectives. People who may come from a minority group may have different stressors or live in different kinds of neighborhoods. And all of those factors come together and impact how people may adhere to a clinical trial, respond to whatever the clinical trial is about, stick with it or withdraw. So having that really good representation is incredibly important. And I think the onus is on us as people who work in the field and in the healthcare system to identify barriers and try to overcome barriers as much as possible, whether they're inherent in the providers themselves or structural, or patients lack the health literacy or comprehension of what's involved, et cetera. The one thing I really want to get across is I think there's a lot of myths and misperceptions about why people don't participate in clinical trials. And I think a lot of these came out with COVID as to why people would or would not get a COVID vaccine or pursue any kinds of interventions to prevent being exposed to COVID or spreading COVID to others. And it's fascinating to me that a lot of these ideas and myths are not based on data. They're not based on evidence. So some of these will draw back to a sense of mistrust of the medical establishment. And if you talk to people and if you look at the evidence, you will see that that's not really the case. In fact, and this is true of our own center, Black patients will agree to participate in a clinical trial at higher rates than their white counterparts. So if there is this inherent sense of mistrust or some historical basis for that, that's not really being manifested in their willingness to participation rates. We've also seen that parents of minority children give consent for their children to participate in clinical trials at higher rates than white parents of their children. So it would again be an example of how, if there is this great sense of mistrust, I'm pretty sure parents are not wanting to put their children on something they thought was potentially dangerous. So I think a lot of that is sort of based on this longstanding historical, and this is not to diminish the history because there certainly is a history, but I think that has been decades ago, and people that are currently being diagnosed with cancer or being screened for cancer or being presented with opportunities to participate in clinical trials, the data are very clear that they're not even aware of a lot of that history. And if they are aware of it, it's like just kind of a name or something that they may have heard about once or twice, but it definitely is not driving their decision making. So I think that's the number one thing that I think we need to be very clear, and we're not assuming that people, oh, well, even if we invite them to participate, they don't want to do that because there's this great sense of mistrust and mistrust of the medical establishment. So of course, the onus is on healthcare providers to make sure that there's no reason for any population to mistrust the medical system or the healthcare system. And, mistakes can happen. And if they do happen, they need to be acknowledged and apologies made and fixed as much as possible. But I think that's one thing. The other thing is, people will give all sorts of numbers about the participation rates in clinical trials that are, we really need to be careful what the denominator is. So there's about 2 million people a year that are diagnosed with cancer of some sort. A large number of those will have early stage cancer where maybe they just need surgery. Maybe they don't need anything else. Those patients are not really going to be benefiting from being on a clinical trial. They don't need to be on a clinical trial. So they should not be part of that denominator. Another part of that population of 2 million people, there may not be any clinical trial open. There may not be a clinical trial open at the institution where they're being seen, or there may not be any clinical trials for their particular disease. Perhaps it's a very rare tumor, or it's something that the standard of care is so well established that there are no clinical trials for that particular tumor type or stage. And so again, those people really shouldn't be included in the denominator. So if you're really very kind of rigorous and scientific about it, when we get down to it, the participation rates are actually probably better than what people cite a lot of the times, where they may cite, 5%, 3%, 8% of patients with cancer participate in clinical trials. Yes, that is true if you look at the 2 million as the denominator. But if you really look at who needs to be on a clinical trial, and of that group, who has a clinical trial open, and of that group, who's actually agreeing to be in a clinical trial and participating and are eligible and all that, then you can get to some very different numbers. Just a word about eligibility. We've had a problem, particularly with cancer clinical trials, of making eligibility criteria very, very strict. And that has been addressed over time to make trial eligibility less exclusive, so that, people who had comorbidities, maybe they had diabetes or hypertension or some other problem that perhaps was well controlled, there was a tendency to exclude them right off the bat. So they were not going to be in the clinical trial. And something like, an elevated creatinine, maybe that was not problematic, but that would exclude people from a clinical trial. And so, particularly among some of our underrepresented groups, they may have a higher rate of diabetes, or they may have a higher rate of hypertension, or a higher rate of, renal disease, where, those groups are going to be excluded at higher rates than perhaps other groups. So there's been a real effort over, I'd say the past 5 to 10 years, of trying to make those eligibility criteria, particularly for national trials, less stringent. Not that they're not protecting people and making sure, we're not going to do anything to harm participants, but not being so just sort of almost random in terms of, we just don't want anyone with any of these comorbid conditions to be taking part in these clinical trials. And when you think about it, there's high rates of diabetes and hypertension and other problems of the population in the United States. And so if you exclude all those people from clinical trials, then if you now are in your community oncology office and you happen to have hypertension, which would not be, so rare, and you want to be on this particular drug that was shown to be effective in clinical trials, now what do we really know about how it works in people that have hypertension? So there's kind of almost a little twist in the logic, and perhaps an overabundance of concern about protecting people from, not making them harmed by whatever the trial is asking about, which certainly we don't want to do, but also making sure that, again, the results are generalizable, so that it's not just applicable to this tiny little group of people who fit these very stringent eligibility criteria and have the resources to get to the academic cancer center and have the resources to have lodging and transportation and pay out of pocket and all these things. So when we exclude people, we decrease the generalizability, and that is bad for everyone and bad for patient care. And it restricts the applicability of clinical trials.